Alright, to continue on, I'm on the bottom of page 373. One of the things that the author will say in here is he's going to start talking about routes and route patterns. And the way this is set up, not always, but typically, if you walk up to somebody, especially as a person gets older, and you say, are you a Republican or a Democrat? They might say they're a Republican, they might say etc. And maybe you'll say, well, I vote for the candidate. That might very well be. But most people as they get older are one or the other. All right? In much the same way, you would think that when you start working with these things in URL and URL patterns, etc., that they would be either conservative in the way they work or they'd be more liberal in the way they work. But they're both. And that's what the author is going to talk about in here. With some of the way that they're set up, it's set up very conservatively, and some of it, the way that it's set up, is set up more liberally. All right? Okay. So you already know, looking up at the screen here, this will be in the book, but you've already seen this. But if you look up here, you all know, you're all smart enough to know that if I go into the route config file, all right, what's it saying here? Well, it says if I don't provide anything, it says to assume the home controller. And if I don't provide a method, it says the index method. All right? And it says that it's possible that I can have IDs, but they're optional. And again, I know you all know that. Do you all realize from when we went over this, when we did the sports store project, if you look up on the screen, please, do you realize that, for instance, if we asked for a list of products, if we asked for every product that was in the sports store, we didn't have an ID parameter. But if we said we wanted to edit an existing product, or if we wanted to delete an existing product, etc., we had to pass it in an ID. I'm hoping you realize that. So when they said that and you had to pass in an ID, that's what they're talking about here. All right? Now, there's a lot more that you can do with IDs than just that, but that's how we've used them so far. So the author does mention here, if you take a look right here, if you've got HTTP:// etc., admin index, he talks about this. These are words you're going to hear for the rest of this chapter. So again, if you look up on the screen here, at the top of the screen, those things that are in there are referred to as segments. That's the way that they're referred to in MVC land. That might not be the way you refer to them as a web developer, but that's the way that ASP.NET MVC refers to them. So this particular website, in this case right here, has two segments. All right? And again, you know as well as I do, I'm not going to do this, but if I go back and I just run the project right now, it's going to run it as though I put in here home/index, even if I leave that out. All right? Because those are the default segments. Home is the default controller segment. Index is the default method segment. That should make sense to you. All right? And that's what they're showing here, controller action. All right? Now, one thing about this, look on the screen here, because this becomes more important later, that for lack of better words, the routing system is stupid. All it does when you go and start putting stuff in is it goes to that route config file, and it doesn't, if there's 10 matches in there, it could care less. When it finds the first match, that's where it goes. That's all it cares about. All right? And what does it do if it finds no match whatsoever? Usually you're going to get something like a 404 error, like a file not found. All right? And I mean, you know this already. Again, I don't mean to keep belaboring stuff, but I'm going to run this. And you already saw what came up. You've already seen this. Okay? But if I go in there and I say /Jeff/index, all right, it says that resource can't be found. But what error is it giving me? It's giving me a 404 error. As far as the system is concerned, It doesn't even know about Jeff, but it says there's no Jeff index file. So either that means there's no Jeff controller, or there's no index file under a Jeff controller, or both. And it doesn't care. All right, it's just basically giving you back some information. All right, that's kind of what the author is talking about in here. So when you look, this looks kind of funky when you look at it, because you might look at this and go, well, that isn't true. Notice when it matches URLs, all of these work except the last two. And the first time I read this, I thought, well, what's wrong with the second last one? What it's saying is by default. By default. All right, if you don't have it set up that it by default goes to an index, there'll be one too few segments. It won't know where to go. All right, and look at this. This works. You know, it's going to give you a 404 error, but what does that do? This thinks it's an admin controller and an index method. This thinks it's an index controller and an admin method. The point is, all it's doing is it's counting parameters. And it says, up to there, that's okay. Up to there, that's okay. Up to there, it doesn't say do they exist or not. It's just counting. That's why I said in many ways the routing setup is kind of dumb. Also, what you'll notice, I already said this to you in an earlier lecture, and I even gave you an example of something that wasn't with routes. You must put the most specific route first, then the next most specific route second, then the next most specific route third. In other words, if you look on the screen, that one, this one, always, always must be last. If you don't put that one last, as soon as it finds that, it's just stupid. It's going to run that one. All right? So that is the most general route there is. So for that reason, it must go at the end. It's very similar, as I mentioned. You're going to see this again next semester in Java, that when you are doing try-catch, all right, when you are doing exception handling, the most specific errors have to be first. The most general errors have to be last. And it's the same type of principle. All right. That's why it says here, again, you can read it yourselves. I don't want to read to you. It's both conservative and liberal. All right. He talks most of the chapter about how conservative it is. A little bit on liberal, but not as much. All right. Okay. As it says, the routing system does not know anything about an MVC application, and it doesn't care. All right. So the URL patterns will match even if there's no corresponding controller. That was like that apples and oranges, or index admin as opposed to the admin index. All right. So the author says here, once you have a URL pattern in mind, you can use it to define a route. You already know routes are defined inside of route config. So this is what it looks like. So again, look on the screen. This is the stuff I started giving you right here. So I don't know how many there are, but you'll notice, and it was just did copy and paste, but even that, it took a while to copy and paste about 300 lines. All right? So this is what you get by default. This is what we've been looking at. So again, bottom of page 375. And as the author mentions here, the static register routes method that is defined in here, that's this one. All right? It's called from global ASAX.cs. What does that mean? That means that your point of origin into your program is this file right here, global.asax. And there inside of there is a global.asax.cs file. And if I open that, you'll notice that what's called first? It says, do you have any areas? And if you do, register those. We haven't dealt with areas yet. We'll talk about them in the next chapter. But, so that it basically skips that because there's nothing to do. So what does it call next? It calls the register routes method of the routeconfig.cs file. So that calls this, Does that make sense to everybody? That's just the natural way that your program starts. All right? And when it calls that, if I've got 50 routes in here, it goes through all of them basically, and it's building a route table. All right? All right. The author says he's highlighted the call, so yeah, we've already talked about that. That's fine. The other call, again, the thing about areas will be in the next chapter. Okay? We're going to actually talk more about areas than the author even does. Why? Just because I think I'm going to try to see if we can put an area. I'm going to go back to some of the stuff I've written and see if we can add an area. All right? So, the author says, okay, well, so what do we want to do here? It says it shows how to create a route using the example URL pattern from the previous section. All right, so what do we have here? Well, we've got this. It pretty much is what we had before, but notice that the syntax is different. What do I mean? Again, look up on the screen, please. All right, here we've got this. Where is it? You can do it as 2 lines of code, or you can do it as a single line of code. All right, and that's all I believe what the author is trying to tell you in here. You've got your choice over how it's done. So a natural question then might be, well, why would you want to do it in 2? This is less code. That makes sense. But maybe there is something you have to check, some machine setting. I don't know. That you have to check, and based on that machine check that maybe you even do in between these 2 lines, maybe there's a machine check right there. You're checking for a certain browser, a certain kind of machine, a certain hardware requirement, or whatever. All right? And maybe you want to make a change to what's in here before you do that. Here you can't do that because it's one and done. It's just all there. 99.999% of the time, you're going to choose this one because it's less code, and no, you're not doing anything like that. But the author is just trying to show you that it can be broken up into 2 lines if that's what you want to do. All right. So that's what he gets to in there, and he talks about it in here too. So like I said, I don't want to just keep belaboring the point rather. All right. Okay. So bottom of page 377. Using the simple route. It says you can see the effect of the changes I made to the routing by starting the example application. All right. If we go back and change it to this, can somebody tell me, look on the screen here, what's missing right there? What's missing right there? We don't have that default parameter in there, do we? The ID. All right. So if you run through the stuff that's in here and you go to admin index, for example, it's not because of that. I mean, that'll still work. All that stuff is in there, will still work. But if we tried to pass an additional parameter in, we get an error message because it's only expecting 2 things. Whereas right now, again, if you look in here, now it's expecting 2 things, but it can be provided with a 3rd thing. Okay? If we take that out and just have it set up with just these 2, that's all you can provide are the 2 things. You won't be able to provide an ID. All right? All right. Like I said, I'm skipping the unit tests, so everything that's here that is on page 378, 379, 380, up until halfway into page 381. So that's where I'm going to next. And you want to try that stuff? Fantastic. And if you don't, it's okay. All right. Okay. So I'm on the middle or bottom part, I should say, of page 381, defining default values. All right. And the author says, had you gone back and made that change and left that out and tried to pass yet a 3rd parameter or a 3rd segment, you'd get an error. All right. And it says, the author explained earlier that these URL patterns are conservative. They will only match It's going in there and it's looking for a pattern match. And the first one that it finds that matches the pattern, it uses that one. It doesn't matter where it is, but it goes from top to bottom. That's why, again, you must put the most general one at the bottom. And as you go up, more and more specific. All right. So, again, that's when the author comes in. Well, let's take a look at what he says here. Providing a default value in the route config file. Okay? So it says a default value is applied when the URL doesn't contain a segment that can be matched to the value. All right? So when you look right here, we've got controller action. Okay? This is the default value. So in other words, all this is saying is if all I use is the name of the controller, run the index. You can say, well, that's what we're doing now. But now they're specifying it in a little bit of a different format. So when you look at this, and you look at what's on the screen here, on the top of page 382, and you compare that with this, it actually is a little bit different. All right? So which one is going to be called, you know, if you just put, you know, pass in, I don't know, home index or whatever. Whichever one is listed first in there. All right? If you've got two things that are at the same level, the one that's listed first in this file will be called, and the second one will always be skipped. And he does a lot of talking about that in here throughout the chapter. All right? So here, providing action and controller default values. All right? So look at the difference. Again, look at what's on the screen here in this example. All right, look what's on the screen. All right, home and index. All right, and compare, contrast, whatever that with this. It doesn't look very different. Again, there are only two parameters that are in there. But if you look, let's see if I can get it all up, I think so. All right. Controller equal home, action equal index. Again, we're missing what we talked about before. We're missing that third parameter that currently is in there as being optional. All right. So again, he shows you how to match things up, etc. Okay. This, the way that these are set up, this is what I want you guys to understand. Those are default values. What that's saying is if I pass in just the port number, nothing else, then use this, and then use this. But if I pass in a different controller, don't use home. Use that different controller that I passed in. All right? And if I use a different method, then call that. And what do I mean? Again, I think you get it, but I just want to be sure. And that is, we already looked at this. We ran this, and it came up and it called home index. You already saw this. All right? But I think this is the one. What was that? Was it customers list? Maybe it wasn't, but of course not. It couldn't be that easy. What are they called? Of course, not that. Customers, customer. All right. That works. Okay, and what the author is saying there is even in this one, this is what I want you to get. These are defaults. So again, what the author is saying right there is if you don't provide the name of a controller, use the home controller. If you don't provide the name of an action, use index. But when I just typed in customer and I typed in list, then customer replaced this and list replaced that. So it knew what to do. It was basing it off of the one pattern that we do have in here. All right? Another small unit test there. And next they talk about static URL segments. Okay? So I am on the bottom of page 383. Okay. It says not all of the segments in a URL pattern need to be variables. You can also create patterns that have what are called static segments. Look on the screen, please. What they're going to do in this example that's right here is they're going to say, hey, I still want the default to be home. I still want the index to be the default method, but I only want you to be able to call stuff that's under public. All right, so it's kind of like you've all done this. You've got a bunch of files that are related to one another. You put them in a folder. Now you got a bunch of folders, and they're kind of related to one another, so you put them in a bigger folder. It's kind of what they're doing here, where the bigger folder would be products, and one of the smaller folders would be home. And one of the things inside of home would be index. All right? So, who cares? Well, again, look in here. Okay? What I'd like you guys to do is to sit there and go through these. Not right now, but to eventually go through these, run them, make sure they work. So in other words, what you'll do is you will put this one, as an example, at the top of the route config file. You can leave the other one in there, but you'll put that one in there. Run it again, etc. All right? So it says this new pattern, once you put it in, must have 3 segments. There is segment 1. There is segment 2. There is segment 3. Can somebody tell me, if I were to do this and I put in there after the name of the port /public, what would it attempt to call? It's not. It's right in front of your face. What controller would it look for by default? Yeah. And what method? The index method. All right. But the one thing that's there that's not in curly braces, the one thing that's required in there is, for lack of better words, it's more a constant than it is a variable. So in other words, this is assuming that everything that we want to map our routes to is under public. Does that make sense? Does that not make sense to anybody? You can mix this stuff together. So notice here, we've got public / curly brace controller / curly brace action. Now, this, notice there's no slash there. All right? So this is mixing segments in there. Still has to start with an X. But as the author says, in this pattern, all it says is the first letter must be X. All right? So that's assuming that any controller starts with X. That's kind of a stupid example. All right, because how many times are you going to do that? But I think the author is just trying to show you, for lack of better words, a little bit of work with pattern matching. All right? On page 385, middle of the page, route ordering. Okay? The author says, previously defined a new route and placed it before all the others. This is, again, him trying to say why you have to order it in the way you are told to order it. Right? Okay. And all he does is he keeps playing around with this. Now when you take a look right here, all right, mixing static URL segments and default actions. So we've got this thing. I'm on page 386 on about the middle of the page. So he shows you this, and then he says the route we added matches any 2-segment URL where the first one starts with the word shop. All right, and the action value is going to be this. And if you don't specify, the controller that is going to be used is going to be home. All right, that's all this chapter is. And the more I'm thinking about this, I put this in there thinking you'd run these. You're probably not going to run those anyway, so we'll talk about this at the end of the chapter. All right? Okay. All right. And again, notice what they put in there. Shop index. What is that saying? Well, it says by default, call home if you can't find it and run its index. So even though we don't have anything called shop, that won't break. All right. When I say broken link, true or false, everybody in here knows what I mean. You've gone out to a website before where you get a broken link. That's considered unbelievably poor programming practice. In fact, as a webmaster, you should be going out on really just about a daily basis. And anything you're linking to, you should be checking that. You probably write some kind of a file, all right, some kind of an operating system like file that would do it for you. All right. But you don't want broken links. All right. Now, when you do that, you can also do what's called aliasing. Well, the good news is you all know what aliasing is because we did aliasing when we were doing the database stuff earlier this week. All right. So as we take a look here and then we look again afterwards, it says, notice again, I have placed the new route so it's defined first. See how he keeps adding these? So it's going to look for this first. If it doesn't find it, it's going to look for that one. If it doesn't find it, it's going to look, etc. Right? And there's another unit test. On the bottom of 387, a little bit on the top of 388. All right. So you can come in, as they say here on the top of 388, you can define your own custom segment variables. So it says here, defining additional variables in a URL pattern. All right. Why would you want to do that? All right. Maybe somebody has got something, and they'll talk about this a little later too. But as an example, maybe somebody has something that's been renamed. All right. And typically what you do right now, whether you realize it or not, or what's done for you. Let's say that I've got a website. I don't care what it's called. It's called hello.html. The file that you want to go to is hello.html. But now somebody changes the name of it so it's hello123.html. Should you care? No. You really should be able to still type in hello.html and be redirected to the new site. Does that make sense to everybody? They're talking about here how you could do that. So you could come in with your own variable names if you wanted to in order to do that. And they come in here with their own names, and notice what they do here, just so you see it. All right. Is they come in and they basically set up a custom variable. And they're saying that if you pass something, show the custom variable. And if you don't pass anything, just show the words default ID. All right. So you got your own variable here. You can pass in whatever you want. It's a string, so it wouldn't matter. If we put 1, 2, 3 there, it would say 1, 2, 3 here. All right. But if you pass nothing in, so if you just have the port name /home/custom variable without a value, all right, without a value, it's going to go and just put in default ID. Now, when you do this too, show that in here. I mean, there's a few things you're going to have to think about, and that is you may have to make some changes because recall that a regular ID that you use is an int by default, and now you're using a string. Another unit test on the bottom of 390. Okay, now we're up to 391. And, I'm looking at your faces. This is the kind of lecture that's as fun to give as it is for you to listen to. Okay? All right. I went back and read this for about the third time this morning. And that's all I kept thinking to myself. All right. Using custom variables as action method parameters. I'm on page 391. So as the author says, using that route data values is only one way of doing this. The other way is much more elegant. And this is where, even though the routing mechanism is kind of stupid, it recognizes cues. All right, so what does it say here? It says, if I define parameters to the action methods with names that match URL pattern variables, all right, the framework will pass the values obtained from the URL as parameters to the action method. It says, for example, the custom variable that's going to be defined, that was defined earlier, was called ID. It says I can modify the custom variable, all right, so that it has a matching parameter. What's new here? Well, look on the screen, please. This is in our controller file. Notice now we're passing something in. This is the way you typically do it if the ID that you want to use is not an int. You would do it this way. And then the system will say, oh, you set that up to this, that was a string. So treat the ID now as though it's a string. Again, some of this stuff, for lack of better words, I'm skipping over. Okay? All right. Optional segments, bottom of 391 and going on to 392. As it says, an optional segment is one that you don't need to specify, but for which no default is specified. So if you leave it off, there isn't a default. All right? That's why you've already seen this. URL parameter dot optional. Okay? It doesn't have a default value put there. So they give you, again, this will work because it'll use the defaults. This will work. This will work. This will work. This one won't work because it's expecting 0, 1, 2, or 3 parameters, and you're giving it 1, 2, 3, 4 parameters, so it doesn't know how to handle it. All right, middle of page 393. Using optional URL segments to enforce separation of concerns. All right. It says some developers don't like putting default values for segment variables. All right. So again, they're saying if this is an issue, and it's very similar to what they showed before. But before, if you look here, this was inside of your controller where you were setting that up. All right. Where we just looked at this. It was in, well, it was in register routes, but up above was in the controller. All right. They're saying if you don't want to do that, go right into the method that you're using and put it in there. All right. Now, notice in here we've got question mark, question mark. See that? And we've actually seen that in a few code places before. Okay? So what it's saying is it can be one of these two values. If there's an ID, it's the ID. Otherwise, it's no value. It's like the question mark colon, but it's not a true-false test. That's why in this case, notice they passed it. They didn't give you a variable, so it said no value. So that part was true. All right. So, middle of page 393, again, using optional URL segments, kind of what we just talked about. All right. Another unit test here. Next, jumping into variable length routes. And again, I'm doing this. I'm taking the time to do this because, to me, you've got this book. All right. There was a decent project in it for several chapters, but he went over a bunch of stuff that he didn't explain. He just put it in there. So he spends most of the rest of the book trying to explain the stuff that he demonstrated earlier. All right? And for completeness, that's what I'm doing. All right. Another way it says of changing the default types of patterns is to accept a variable number. See this? This is a key word. Catch-all. And actually, the catch-all isn't the key word. The asterisk is. You know what an asterisk means from different operating systems. 0 or more. That's what this means. This means it expects a controller, and it expects a method, and it expects an ID, and you can have any number of parameters following, including 0. He used catch-all because it's a convenient word, but it's the asterisk that's doing that. So all of these will work. In fact, he could have just kept going, as he shows here on 394. He could have just kept adding more and more, or 395. He could have just kept adding more and more. All right, so you could have as many parameters here as you want. All right, another unit test then on the bottom, jumping up to the next page onto 396, prioritizing controllers by namespaces. All right, it says when an incoming URL matches a route, the framework takes the value of the controller variable and looks for an appropriate name. Makes sense. So if it was home, it's going to look for a controller called home. All right. This is basically, that's what it is. It says this is an unqualified name, meaning the framework doesn't know what to do if you add 2 home controllers. Please look on the screen. What the author has you do is create a new folder called additional controllers. In that new folder, he has you put in another file. So in other words, you come into here, you've got your controllers, you come in here and you add, all right, you add a new folder, and you call that additional controllers. And then inside of the additional controllers folder, you come in and you add a new controller. Doesn't matter really, but I'll just make it empty. And you call it home. I don't get any errors. But depending on how I've got my system set up, it may or may not recognize what I'm trying to do. And if you look on the screen here, what the author mentions is if I run this and start it, let's see if I get that error or not. All right, because he's made a lot of changes and tweaks and stuff in here. Let's just run it. Again, it may work. I'm hoping it doesn't. I'm hoping we get the same error that you see on 396. There you go. So the system says, hey, you've got 2 things that are called home controller. Even though they're in different folders, I still can't reconcile that. All right. Again, that's the same error that's in the book on page 396, the one that's right here. So as it says, the framework searched for a class called home controller, but it found 2 of them. All right. Now, the same kind of thing can happen with databases. You may end up seeing this in the project that we do. But when we are running a query and we say single or default, do you hear me? If we say single or default, the system is expecting it's going to find none or 1. That's what the single means. But if it returns 2, what happens is the system doesn't know how to handle it. It throws an exception. That's basically is what happened here. It found 2 home controllers, so it threw an exception. All right. Now, why is this? Who cares? Well, imagine we were working, just imagine we're all working at the same company. All right? And we're each doing a piece of a different project. I don't care what the project is, but we're each doing a piece of a project. And I decide I'm going to create this controller for the stuff I'm doing, and it's called I call it account controller. Okay? And Devin is working on a different part of the project, but he creates his own controller and he calls it account controller. Now when we go and unit test and put our pieces together, it breaks because we've got two different account controllers. And that kind of stuff happens a lot where people basically have the same names. All right? So the author says it arises more often than you think to address the problem. And the other way, too, is you call something that's the same name as some kind of a system property or a system something. You just didn't know it existed. So it says to address the problem, we can tell the MVC framework to give preference to different namespaces. All right? So notice what we have there. Please look on the screen. All right? We're telling it to call home and index, but we want this home index called. You don't want to list both of them. If you list both of them, the same error is going to occur. But what you're saying is, hey, home index, that home index. I don't care how many of them there are. That one. All right? So you get it. You can make this thing larger as long as there's different names. So notice we're mapping a route here and we're mapping a route there. What's the difference? This one, okay, is the add controller. This is the home one. All right? And it'll work because they're in two different arrays. So it'll look based on where you are calling or where you are running this from. This would work with both of those home controllers. But in this case, you'd have to preface it with whatever we call that controller, the catch-all thing, slash. Okay? You can turn these on, and you can turn them off, too, by setting it to false. All right. Constraining routes. I'm up to page 399. Middle of the page. The author says here, at the start of the chapter, we described how patterns are conservative. The previous few sections have explained a lot of different ways you can do this. It says it is now time to look at how to control the liberalism. All right? So, look up on the screen here, please. You may or may not remember this. I'm going to give you some advice. Take it or leave it. All right, but look on the screen if you would. If you are going to apply for a job that involves any kind of programming, I don't care if it's C#, if it's Java, if it's ASP.NET, if it's web programming, doesn't matter. Before you go for that interview, especially if you think there's a chance they might give you a test on your knowledge of certain things, go out to this website. And I've shown this to you before. It's regular-expressions.info. Because this allows you to work with regex. We've done a little bit of this stuff before in other classes. What regex is it's pattern matching. All right? Such as, this pattern says it's got a caret there, which means start with. So this must start with an H, and it can be followed by 0 or more characters. All I'm telling you is I've done a lot of programming work for different places in my life, and at one time or another, at every place I ever worked for, I had to work with pattern matching. You could very well, because a lot of companies are doing this today, you go into for an interview at a company. Oh, Luke, you got an hour? We would like you to take this test. They're not going to sit there. There won't be an internet. You're not going to be able to Google it. All right, but it'll be basic types of things. So, I mean, I could have come in here and done something like this. regular expression cheat sheet. All right. So it'll show you all the different things that you can use. Now, I'm not saying, yeah, you'd have to go and memorize every one of them. No. But ones that are common. The regular expression for a telephone number. The regular expression for a zip code. Believe it or not, the regular expression for an email is very difficult. And if you really want to learn this, and I've shown you this site before too, go out to HTML5 patterns.com. It's very ugly. Come on, I know that's it. There it is. It's pattern, not patterns. Okay? So if I want to know how to set up something, again, postal code. There's the US one. What does this mean? This means digits. 5 digits followed by, since it's in parentheses, optionally a hyphen and 4 digits. All right? So again, notice, try it out. 55555. And it works. 55555 dash. Doesn't work. All right? But I'd say more than anything else, postal or zip code and phones. Again, with phones, same kind of thing. But the bad thing with phones is, do you want it to be number, dash, number, dash, number? Do you want to allow parentheses? If you allow parentheses, do they have to have a space after the right parenthesis, or is that optional? Because you can write some really complex patterns. It doesn't take very long for these things to get really complex. All right. So I'm on the middle of page 400, constraining a route to a set of specific values. More pattern matching. Okay? This says starts with an I and ends with an X. Just index. That's all that'll have. The pipe sign that's here means or. So this says the action that it will support. This is any controller that starts with an H, but it must have an index method or an about method. Does that make sense? All right. It goes even further than this. This isn't so much pattern matching, but if you look on page 401, the author now says, what kind of HTTP method are you going to use? Am I right? Am I right in assuming everybody in this room understands the difference between HTTP and HTTPS? Am I right in assuming you all know the difference? Is there anybody that doesn't? All right. The S typically stands for secure socket layer, but the idea is there's an extra layer of security put in. And if you've never heard this before, if you're ever applying for anything, when you're giving information and that information is private, social security number, whatever it happens to be, the URL at a minimum should always start with an HTTPS. So they go into that. This is not get and set that we talked about before. All right. Another unit test. Okay, I'm jumping down to the bottom of page 402. Using type and value constraints. All right. It says the MVC framework contains a number of built-in constraints that can be used to restrict URLs. All right. They show some examples here on the next page. That's a range route. So it's expecting the length to fall within that range. There are so many different things that you can set in here. This is one of those parts of programming right there with if you have to go in, the more of this stuff you're putting in, the more secure you're making the system. Does that make sense? Because you're putting in more and more requirements. And not that anybody in this room says, yeah, I'm getting into programming because, let's face it, it's sexy. But I would tell you that this is the least sexy part of it. All right, because you're building in all the stuff that's behind the scenes. All right, the stuff that nobody will ever see unless you need it and it's not there. All right, then it becomes, like you would probably guess, very, very important. So they show you, these are some built-in things. I'm not going to read any of them, but hopefully they make sense. Alpha, alpha only, that kind of thing. Again, these are more requirements, and as I mentioned, the more of these requirements that you put in, the more secure you are setting the system up to be. And like I said, hopefully that just makes sense. All right, we don't have much left, but there is about 10 pages. We've been going for almost an hour again. It's 2:40. Let's come back, please, at 2:55. Finish it up at that time.